You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Cindy Cohn can remember using punched cards for computing during her college years in Iowa. She can tell you about watching the rise of the internet and home computing with her techie friends in San Francisco. And she can also recall the times she has stood in court working to protect someone's rights to put encrypted code on the internet, or the fight against the NSA's mass surveillance system after 9/11 and the Patriot Act. Cohn has led the Electronic Frontier Foundation, either as its legal counsel or its executive director, for 25 years. That's a nonprofit that advocates for privacy and speech. This year, she announced she's leaving her role, but not before putting out a memoir she hopes will inspire others to take up the work. Cindy Cohn is the author of Privacy's Defender, My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. And she is going to be here in Seattle speaking at Town Hall on Tuesday, March 17th. Cindy, thank you so much for being here, and it's great to get to meet you. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, thank you so much. You know, EFF has a strong Seattle contingent, and I'm very excited to come up and talk about the book.
Cindy Cohn, what does privacy mean to you?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, some people think about privacy like, you know, the Harry Potter invisibility cloak that you throw over your head before you do something you don't want anybody to see. And, you know, that's true. Privacy can give you that. But I think of privacy as a check on power. Privacy is a way that people with less power can create the space to get access to information, build community, have the conversations they need to maybe later do a public push for change.
So you open the book with a pivotal case that is Bernstein versus the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice. And this case was about encryption. At the time, somebody needed a federal license to post encrypted code on the internet. And the results of the case were really foundational to what we know as the modern internet. Can you kind of explain what happened in this case?
Yeah. So when we started, the U.S. government had software with the capability of maintaining secrecy on the list of things you couldn't export from the United States without a munitions license. And, you know, like next to surface to air missiles and tanks and things like that. And, you know, it made a bit of sense. I mean, if you know your history, you know that the Allies' ability to break the German codes and the Japanese codes are one of the keys to why, you know, we won World War II. So it wasn't crazy for the military to think of encryption as something of theirs, but it was clear to some of the founders of the EFF and some hackers, and I use that in the best sense of the word, some hackers on the early internet, that this technology was going to have to be freed if the rest of us were going to have security and privacy when we went online. And we brought a case in federal court here in San Francisco at first on behalf of a math PhD student named Dan Bernstein, who wrote a little computer program that was encryption, and so needed to get the license. And of course, they weren't giving the license to strong encryption like what Dan wrote. It was actually a pretty simple program, but it was strong enough that he got a no, and we knew that. So we challenged the regulations on the grounds of the First Amendment, that publishing computer code is part of what should be protected speech, which doesn't mean the government can't regulate it at all, but it means it has to meet a very, very high standard to do it. You know, in addition to being a munition and a privacy and security tool we all need, encryption is actually a science. The science of cryptography is an ongoing, you know, scientific method conversation that even in the early 90s was happening online. So we brought this under the First Amendment, arguing that Dan's code was speech and that the government's regulations had to meet a very, very high standard under something called the prior restraint doctrine. And, you know, this little ragtag team of me and a bunch of hackers and kind of some lawyers that we pulled in, like, we were successful. We got the judge to agree with us that the government's regulations violated the First Amendment. And ultimately, after, you know, there was a lot of public pressure too, lots of other things happened, but the government backed down. And that's why we have, you know, tools like Signal that people are increasingly using to organize and have conversations that are able to be protected against more powerful forces. And it's why a lot of the back end of the internet has encryption in it too. Now, you know, don't get me wrong, we have a long way to go to make a secure internet. We're nowhere near where we need to be. But without encryption, I think we'd be in a much worse place.
You address one of the biggest challenges for privacy for Americans over the last 30 years, the Patriot Act. And this was passed by Congress shortly after 9/11. It gave the FBI and the NSA significantly more leeway to access people's metadata online. How did the Patriot Act change your work at the EFF, at the Electronic Frontier Foundation?
I mean, it was really foundational. It happened right after I joined EFF full time, and it really has set the tone for so many things that we've done since then. Because it was an opportunity. It was a time in which we decided, and some of this was intentional. The national security infrastructure of the United States had failed horribly. Right? They didn't warn us about this. They didn't follow up on all of the leads that they had, that there was a potential attack inside the United States. And the first thing they did was blame our rights. The Patriot Act, both the things that they did in the Patriot Act that we could see and what later turned out to be a whole bunch of secret programs that were only uncovered later by whistleblowers and journalists, really decided that our rights were the problem, and that we needed, they kept talking about, the balance between privacy and security as if they were on some kind of teeter-totter, that if we gave up more security, we'd get more privacy. It doesn't work that way. It never has. And when the 9/11 Commission came out a couple of years later and actually looked at how did this happen, it didn't find that our rights were the problem. It found that the administration had gotten so secure in its theories of what would happen that it ignored tons and tons of flashing red lights about this possibility. But by then it was kind of too late, and Congress had already done a lot of this, and there was not an appetite to go back and try to reset things. And so that's what we have been doing ever since. And one of the biggest shifts that they pushed on things is that, the Fourth Amendment, being secure in your papers, the kind of investigatory tactics that are okay under the Constitution and our laws are all based on the government having to make its case before it gets information about you. Not a full case, but you have to be a target. It's called probable cause in the context of the Fourth Amendment, but that they have to do some work to figure out who their targets are first, and then they get the ability to surveil us. And this got flipped on its head. And instead, what they started doing was doing mass surveillance, where they're collecting massive amounts of information, some of it content, a lot of it non-content metadata, and then sifting through that to figure out who they might want to target for further things. And this is, I think it's profoundly unconstitutional. I think there's a good argument to be made, even if you care about originalism and historical precedent, that this is not what the founders thought they were approving. But it's also just not good for our privacy, and it causes a lot of collateral problems in terms of self-government, in terms of being able for people to function in order to be able to organize and plan to make social change and other kinds of changes if we're all susceptible to government monitoring, and then we don't know how they're exercising their power to decide later who to target. But we're starting to see it now a lot more clearly than we used to, with the way that they're targeting some of these sweeps, immigration sweeps, and the way that they're beginning to target protesters and organizers and people who are engaging in their First Amendment right to observe and monitor the police. We're beginning to see how this mass surveillance is an incredibly powerful and scary tool in the hands of a government. Even the most responsible government in the world shouldn't have this power. But now we're really seeing what happens when it's in the hands of a government that doesn't care about rule of law and that is willing to push norms and laws to their very end.
Yeah, I want to get to more about the work you're doing today when it comes to the data that Americans have collected by their government, and especially what's been going on with the immigration crackdown, and also just sharing between government agencies, in the Trump administration. But before we get there, I wonder if we can just walk through, you mentioned whistleblowers and their importance in the history of what we understand now as the modern surveillance state. I want to take us back to 2005 and a whistleblower who came to your office in San Francisco in the Mission. He was an AT&T technician, and he basically showed up and was like, hey, do you guys care about privacy? and that was somebody named Mark Klein. He told you about something called Room 641A, and he brought documents about Room 641A. What is the significance of Mark and what he brought to you at the EFF?
It's tremendously important. We lost Mark last year. He passed away, and I'm really sad about that I didn't get the book out in time to really honor what he did because, we had heard rumors that there was some mass spying going on, but nobody could bring us the kind of thing you can use in court. And we were actually building a case. The New York Times had come out with a story in December 2005 about the Bush administration doing spying domestically in the United States. That was very controversial. And Mark had seen this happen, seen this being built at the AT&T facility where he worked in downtown San Francisco. And he didn't think something was right, but he didn't really put it together until he saw the New York Times story and literally in his, great, tan trench coat knocked on our front door at EFF and handed us the schematics for exactly how it worked.
And I just want to say he had actually wired that room, right?
Yes.
He had wired Room 641A, and so he had extremely firsthand knowledge of what was going on.
Yeah. And we ultimately got clearance from the court to publish the schematics, so people can go look at it themselves if they're technical. And you don't even have to be that technical. But the way it worked was kind of clever. So Mark did not have clearance. He didn't get into the room, but they had to connect the fiber optic cables that carry people's communications from the internet, including the international one. This is at a big switching station in San Francisco, to the AT&T, to the NSA's spying network. And what they did was they installed a bank of what are called fiber optic splitters. This is a way that, fiber optics are light. And when you split light, you get a copy. They put a bank of technologies that split this light right outside the secret room. And one copy of the communications would go on its way to where they were going. And a second copy would be shunted into this room that you couldn't get access to unless you had clearance. So Mark was the guy right outside the room who hooked up this machine. And he thought this was wrong, right? There shouldn't be anything standing in between you and the people you're communicating with, except for the networks necessary to process things. But this idea that they were sifting off a copy of every communication that was going through this key switching station into a room that had a bunch of sophisticated analysis tools in it, but that he didn't know exactly how they worked. This is how it actually worked. This took this abstract idea of spying on Americans in America and made it really concrete, and it gave us the evidence we needed to go into court and try to stop it. It was tremendously important, and we've really struggled to get what Mark did the attention that it needed, because the people who control the national narrative sometimes they can ignore you in a way that makes it hard to get over. But he really did a very brave thing. And one of the funny things that happened after that was we were very worried that it was classified, that he might be in trouble for even doing it and giving it to us. But it turned out he was outside the room and what he had was not classified. But at first, the government wanted it and we had to send it to them. And we had a very nervous weekend worrying about both him and us, because it's illegal to possess classified information. And then we got a call from the government attorney, and the government attorney said, well, it's not classified, so you're okay. But AT&T is really mad. It's their documents, and they want them back. And so we had a very quick hearing where the judge was having none of it. But the thing that they did that I don't know that they intended to do was that they did what lawyers call authenticated the documents. We always had this little worry in the back of our minds that they were fake or phony. But when AT&T says those are our trade secrets, we want them back, suddenly we knew we knew for sure that they were real. And I don't know that they intended to authenticate our documents, but they actually did with what they did.
So Mark Klein is one name of a whistleblower that you've worked with over the years. One that maybe more people know is Edward Snowden, the government contractor who the 2013 revelations that he got out to journalists and published really gave Americans that broader picture of how large and intrusive the surveillance state had grown and how much information the NSA was collecting on Americans. Photos of Ed Snowden, like initially that came out, they showed he had an EFF sticker on his laptop.
Absolutely.
And so you kind of had an inkling that he had some affinity for the organization. And just to be clear, you didn't represent him like in his defense in court, but you part of his work, ended up in cases that you brought, right? And you developed a relationship with him. Can you kind of talk about what that was like and how EFF worked with Snowden?
Yeah, it turned out, we didn't know this at the time, but that Snowden had been watching our case and he had been watching us struggle with the government saying, you don't know what you're talking about. This doesn't work the way you think it does. It's not what you think it is. And this in the law came up in a doctrine called standing. Did our clients who were ordinary AT&T users have standing that they could prove that they were subjected to the mass surveillance? And he was mad about that. He was watching this and incredibly dismayed because he knew that we were right. And then, there was a very famous interchange between Senator Ron Wyden and a top NSA official where he said, is the NSA spying on tens of millions of Americans in America? And the guy said, not wittingly. And Snowden knew that was a lie. And because of that, that is really the kind of last straw that led him to release so much information about how not only this spying, but other mass spying programs worked, that it would be impossible for the government to deny that it was happening anymore. And he ended up being represented by a guy named Ben Weisner at the ACLU, who's a dear friend and an excellent lawyer. And we needed Ed to be a witness for us. So you can't be both the lawyer for the witness and the lawyer for the clients. It just, you can do it, but it's messy. And that's why we didn't represent Mark either. We got him other counsel because we wanted to use his witness and his knowledge as a witness. And but the very first time I talked to Ben after this, I said, this is amazing, and he said, yeah, he has a question for you, which is, do you have standing yet? And that was the moment where I realized, oh my God, you never know who's watching what you're doing. What he did was incredibly courageous. And it was in part, it was mainly to make sure the American people knew what was being done in secret in their name. But secondarily, it was so that we could bring these facts to the judge and get a decision about whether it was legal or not for the government to be doing this. And it was incredibly heroic. I did a few years later get to go to Moscow and meet with him. And I have a picture in the book of him and I in a Moscow hotel room. As I say, kind of two people the most obsessed with stopping the mass spying in the world. We just geeked out together about this and how important it was. And he's ended up being, a tremendous asset. He got involved with the Freedom of the Press Foundation, which I tell some of that story as well, which is an organization that that I've helped over the years and has just been a solid voice and sane voice about what, that the American people deserve to know what the country is doing in our name that affects our privacy and our rights.
Can I ask, because you have met and worked with a number of these high-profile whistleblowers over the years, who are these people? Like, who risks so much of their own liberty and safety and their right to have an everyday life, frankly, in order to bring this stuff to light? Like, what does it take?
It just takes tremendous courage. It takes a belief in the principles that founded this country, and a recognition to see the sometimes very vast gap between who we tell ourselves we are and who we actually are in practice. And I think there is a way in which these whistleblowers see this gap, especially when the government is, not only not telling us, but lying to us about what it's doing. They begin to see this gap and they're very, very uncomfortable with it. But the personal cost is high. There aren't very many whistleblowers. There are probably tens of thousands of people who knew about the NSA's mass spying. We had a handful of whistleblowers. And, Snowden wasn't the only one. There's a guy named Bill Binney. There's a few other people who have done the same thing. But uniformly, the personal consequences are very, very high. Ed Snowden doesn't want to live in Moscow. That's just where he ended up when they took his passport away. And he's been a little lucky that President Putin likes to embarrass the United States and has let him stay there. But many people, they lose their jobs, they lose their livelihoods. It's difficult. One guy who was a top NSA analyst who went public ended up having to work at an Apple store, to make ends meet. The consequences are really high, and so these are people who really live their values. And and they're very, very courageous. I would say, though, one thing is that you don't have to be one of those guys to be part of the fight. I mean, I'm not, and lots of other people aren't who are supportive. So I really want to celebrate these kinds of people, but I also want to point out that, like, it's not that way or nothing. There are plenty of things that people are doing right now that are important and not nearly as risky as what these whistleblowers have done. And simply by showing support for them, you're helping to create a safer place for the more courageous to step forward. But part of why I wanted to write the book is that I'm very proud of what I've done, but I'm kind of an ordinary person who got pulled in, wanted to do the right thing, and kept kind of finding ways to do it and have a job at the same time. And I kind of want that story to exist along with the kind of superhero courageous story of some of the whistleblowers, because I don't want people to think that, well, if I can't be Edward Snowden, I should do nothing.
Yeah, if I'm not going to martyr myself on for the cause of freedom, that it doesn't matter, or I can't actually contribute. I'm talking with Cindy Cohn, the author of Privacy's Defender: My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. She's the executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, but soon to be stepping aside. And this memoir is kind of part rallying cry to the next generation, and talking about staying in the fight and who's going to pick up that baton. We'll be right back with more conversation with Cindy Cohn after a quick break here on KUOW. Welcome back to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. I'm talking with Cindy Cohn, the executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the author of a new book called Privacy's Defender: My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. We have been talking about this big fight between Anthropic and the Pentagon, which devolved into Anthropic being labeled a supply chain risk, and OpenAI swooping in, making that deal with the Pentagon to be the contractor. Anthropic reportedly was trying to get guarantees about not using its technology for mass surveillance of people in the United States, also targeting technology. But, for our conversation, we'll probably focus on the mass surveillance part of that. How is AI changing the fight for privacy and your work against mass surveillance, Cindy?
Yeah, it's really supercharging things. For a long time, especially after the Patriot Act, September 11th, the government was really good at collecting information. They were much less good at using it. And the advances in neural networks and AI technology has meant that they're actually much better at being able to use this information and use it at scale. So it's not surprising to me that, Anthropic didn't draw the lines where I would draw in terms of social responsibility, but that domestic mass surveillance is one of their red lines is not a surprise, because it's very easy to see, if you're inside how these systems work, how dangerous it can be to have these kinds of tools without any, real significant privacy protections and legal protections for people. And so I wasn't surprised that this was one of their red lines. And it's tremendously concerning that, that both that the Defense Department is demanding that these companies do whatever they want, regardless of the impact on all of us. And OpenAI isn't the only one that's cooperating with them. Google is, and Oracle and lots of other providers are not even drawing the red lines, or at least maybe kidding themselves about the lines that they're drawing. So it's it's really important that even if you don't like this company, you stand up for companies actually drawing these lines, especially against this government. Our privacy shouldn't be at the whims of a CEO. We shouldn't have to hope that the CEO of any company is the only thing standing between us and, mass surveillance. But we also need them to do it too. It's an all hands on deck moment, and so I think that I appreciate that they're drawing this line. I'm not sure they're drawing it for the same reasons that I would, but if we get protected out of it, I think that's important. But I think we definitely need to pay attention to this. It's not abstract. It's something that they are doing, again, maybe for their own reasons, but that's very important for them, for us, that they draw some lines and not let this new technology be unleashed on all the rest of us without, you know, uh, unleashed on all of the rest of us. Full stop. Honestly.
Can I talk about Congress's role in all of this? Because there is, a part of the law that has to be re-upped every few years. It's called Section 702. It's part of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that was passed in 2008. That is set to expire again in April of 2026. And again, it gets re-upped every few years. This has come up before, but this time there is a proposal from Dick Durbin in Illinois and Mike Lee in Utah that as part of the reauthorization, there would be some reforms. It's confusingly called the SAFE Act, SAFE, because right now the SAVE Act is getting a lot of attention in terms of voter rights. This is the SAFE F Act. And I don't know, just to really quickly go through for people, it would, for example, require the FBI to get a warrant to be looking through the stuff that is collected by foreign intelligence surveillance. So that's domestic law enforcement would have to get a warrant. It would also stop a kind of complicated concept called parallel construction. But it's a little bit like law enforcement can lie about how it originally got the information that it uses against you in court. Like it comes up in foreign intelligence surveillance. Well, then we can, get a domestic warrant for something else and then say, oh, oops, here's the evidence. So it's very deceptive in terms of how law enforcement, got the information on you in the first place. I guess my question for you is, do you expect these reforms to actually get passed? I mean, does Congress have any political will right now to actually rein in the surveillance state?
I mean, I think the odds are long, but I think it's still an important fight. The weird thing about some of this stuff is that it is bipartisan. There's a piece of the Republican Party that doesn't like the mass surveillance. Again, might not be for the same reasons that I don't like it, but it is weirdly, not weirdly, it is importantly bipartisan. Honestly, Mike Lee and Rand Paul, two senators, have always been supportive of this. At the same time, we've got Ron Wyden on the Democratic side. It just hasn't been big enough because the national security people have so many ways to scare the pants off of lawmakers and say, the next 9/11 is going to be your fault unless you give us what we want. The Trump administration has not shown up about what they think about this just yet. So that could have a big impact on, obviously he has to sign a law if Congress passes it, but also, he has such control over his caucus now that if he said, look, we think we need to stop this, I think we could stop it. I think some of these reform bills are great. I think they are chipping away at something that probably we need to kill entirely. But if we can't, we're supportive of some of the chipping away. And the Durbin bill has some good stuff in it. It doesn't go as far as we'd want. Some of the things that get passed as reform aren't. They're worse. So you always have to look. The devil's in the details about these things. But we will see between now. I think it's the end of April 20th. I think is when it expires. We're going to be pushing really hard and trying to get as much support for these reform bills, the real ones, as we can. And it's just a little too early to see where things are going to come down. Traditionally, one of the things Congress does is just kick the can down the road on this if it gets politically expedient too. So that's another option that might happen that we're not happy about. But we will see. This is going to be a big priority for us going forward. Section 702 is how they took that secret surveillance that Mark Klein, revealed to us and that was being done completely outside the law and brought it at least a little inside the law. There's also a worry that if this law goes away, that they'll just go back to doing it in secret under an executive order. So it's important that Congress stay engaged and demand accountability and transparency going forward. There's a lot at stake. We're hoping that we can put something together, but it is a place where really some pressure on members of Congress could help, especially bipartisan, because it's a bipartisan concerns that have been raised.
Yeah, Dick Durbin and Mike Lee not on the same side on most issues, but this one they are. Cindy Cohn, I'm just kind of to wrap us up here thinking about your arc and what you've seen in this work on civil rights and privacy and surveillance. You started with these hopeful, nerdy internet pioneers in San Francisco in the early 90s, and you've taken us through 9/11 and the Patriot Act, and then till today. I mean, the EFF right now has something that they call the Atlas of Surveillance, which maps surveillance happening all over the country. You've been working on issues where, especially with Doge and data privacy and the ways that the Trump administration now is kind of trying to break down those walls between different agencies and the data they share. So like IRS data on immigrants and things like that. But it does feel like when you get wins, it is kind of a Sisyphusian situation where you push the boulder, but it keeps rolling downhill. And I wonder if you ever get disheartened in this work and how you approach it, considering that long arc of history.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely. Everybody goes through the high parts and the low parts, and I try to talk a little bit about in the book about kind of what sustains me, and I talk a lot about community and having a group of people doing this together is always better than feeling like you're all by yourself. And I've always been lucky to have both a group of people professionally and personally to kind of support me. And I think that's really important. I mean, the way I look at it, we've got kind of two options, right? Like you could fight and maybe lose, or you could not fight and lose. Like those are the only options we have in front of us right now. I mean, some people are rich enough that they could go live in the woods and disconnect themselves from technology, but that's not the world I live in, and it's not the world that many people are ever going to get to live in. So if we're going to stand as a community, we have to do these fights. And one of the things that was kind of heartening about the book was looking back and seeing all the things that we actually gained. Even though we did not win the NSA spying lawsuits, by the time we got to the end of it, one program had ended entirely. Another program was pretty dramatic. Both of the two other programs were dramatically changed. Even the Section 702 surveillance, which I do not like, had FISA court surveillance. It had theoretically congressional oversight. Congress has to use it. But we built a lot more protections into that program along the way. And I think, realistically, when you're up against governments and especially national security, you have to take the long view. They have so much more power than we do. We're always the less power. We're always the Davids. We're never the Goliaths. And, that means we have to chip away at things, and we have to think about this as the long run. And I always joke that, the good thing is that the good guys throw better parties. It's a lot more fun to hang out with the good guys than the bad guys. And, I've managed to have a pretty good life with a lot of interesting things happening in it, in these fights. And, that's a good life, even if you don't win all the things. And, over time, by being persistent and having the support of people, I mean, without the EFF membership supporting us, EFF is 125 people now. When I started, it was probably about a dozen. Having both, people who are willing to work at this for the long run and people who are willing to support this for the long run, we can get some victories here. And we, it doesn't mean the fight's ever over. It's not like a TV show where by the third commercial you've solved the crime and you go on to the next one. That is not how change happens when you're up against very powerful forces, but change can happen. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do in the book is inspire people. The techniques and the strategies that we use, some of them have been kind of checkmated. They're not the right strategies for now. I didn't know them when we started. We made it up as we went along. So, I want to encourage people to think strategically and think carefully, but also be willing to turn the page and come up with new things. It's time for that. And part of what I'm hoping to do is to kind of pass the baton.
Cindy Cohn is the author of Privacy's Defender, My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. She's going to be at Town Hall Seattle Tuesday, March 17th. This has been such a pleasure and really inspiring for me, Cindy. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.